So hello, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you're fine. On this 1000th day here in Cannes 2026, welcome to you, Boris. Hello, Boris. We're going to talk about your entire career. The idea is to start about your first films, your beginnings, to talk about Suleiman's story, and to talk about your work as a producer and a trainer. You run courses in Central Africa on movie making. So let's start at the beginning, at the very beginning. Well, you were a philosophy teacher, is that right? Yep. In fact, I did not go to movie school. I didn't do any movie studies. I studied philosophy. I finished my PhD thesis last century. Or it might have been this century, somewhere around that time. And when I finished my PhD, I taught at university. When I'd finished all of my studies, I said to myself, well, I'm not really happy leading this particular life. And so I threw it all out the window. I gave in my notice, and I started to wonder what I really wanted to do with my life. And that's when you went to Vietnam, is that right? Well, I had previously lived in Vietnam. Vietnam changed my life. I'm really happy to see some Vietnamese people here in the audience for that reason. Vietnam did change my life. I had taken a year out for my studies. I went to Vietnam and taught philosophy. And when I left university, when I threw in the towel of academia, my first inspiration, when I thought I wanted to make films, was to go back to Vietnam and to connect again with life in Vietnam, which had been so impactful for me. It really is important when I look at the films that I made later. Films have always been about getting out of my comfort zone, getting out of books, libraries, and going into the real world and traveling far away to live experiences which make me a new person. So you were a bit bored in the life you were preparing for yourself as a teacher. So how did film come into all of this? How did you realize that film would be the solution? Why did you decide to become a filmmaker? And documentaries, in fact. Well, there were several people around me who made documentaries. My ex-wife was making documentaries. I had several friends who made documentaries. And those years, it was the end of the 90s, beginning of the noughties. Those were years which were very favorable for documentaries, particularly here in France. It was the beginning of the TV channel called Arte. And thanks to this TV channel, there was a lot of money for documentaries. There was huge creativity. And documentary makers in France in the 90s and the 2000s, those who were making films before me, they had so many resources to experiment, to make documentaries very freely, to make documentary films. There was a lot of money in TV, but not for TV series, but to make real documentary films. So they were reporting. It was documentaries. So it was really thrilling. I saw a lot of documentary films myself, and it inspired me. I thought it seemed like much more fun compared to what I was doing in the philosophy department at university, in the library, reading these heavy, serious books. So there are two films. There are medium-length films, and the errantes was one of them. What did that teach you about working with a camera? So you had these two works which really taught you a lot, Les chantiers de la coopération and Les âmes errantes. When you start with a documentary, when you start with that kind of documentary, it means you take your camera. I was doing the filming myself. I was my own cameraman. And that gives you a really concrete relationship with the film that you are making. It's not it doesn't, the work isn't carried out in your brain. No, it's in your body. You're in a situation with your camera and you say to yourself, in this particular situation, what is interesting? What is not interesting? Where should I put myself in the room to film these images? What are the right shots that I need to be capturing? What am I triggering? How am I influencing on the real life so that real life becomes the film I want to make? It's all very concrete. There are very cinematographic questions, but they are framed in a very concrete manner, in a very humane manner, because you're interacting with other human beings. And how do you find the theme or the subject of your documentary? Well, I had lived in Vietnam, and I'd been struck by Vietnamese culture. I'd been struck by something in Vietnam, particularly back in the day rather than today. There was the memory of war, what the Vietnamese call the war against the Americans. We call it the Vietnamese War. The memory of that war was very, very present. And in many Vietnamese families, there was an altar dedicated to the ancestors. An altar. The speaker's worried in case I was translating the wrong word, but it is an altar. He thought it might be a hotel, but it's not a hotel. It's an altar, which I got right the first time. So I decided to go into those stories of those Vietnamese people who had lost relations during the war and who could not carry out the mourning for their dead because the bodies had not yet been found, or the bodies were left strewn on the battlefield. And this memory haunted the family some 20, 30 years later. So that's how I entered into documentary. I can't say that that's the case for everybody, but that was how I found my first idea for a documentary. So that's my inroad. I already knew Vietnam. I had a rich relationship with Vietnam, and going in through this doorway deepened my relationship with Vietnam, because all of a sudden I was entering into these families. I would light incense with them at the altar to the ancestors, and it afforded me a very unique place within the memories of these families and within the heart of these families. It was really interesting. I don't really want to dwell too long on those first experiences. I want us to move forward. But the fact is that I started in documentaries. That meant that I had two benefits. Firstly, I was very nostalgic about documentaries. When I was working in fiction, I had nostalgia of what I was doing in documentaries. In a documentary, there are two things. First of all, when you film, when you make a live action film, you take your camera, you press on record, and the world comes to life. When you're in a fiction, you have to recreate a lot of things. You have to create the background. You have to construct a backdrop. You have to get your actors to act. It's just not spontaneous and it's not automatic. And so I was very nostalgic about that. It really gets on my nerves having to direct the actors. I don't understand why they're not already playing the role. Why haven't they become the character that I've written for them that they're supposed to be playing? They should have incorporated that already. And when I made my second fiction film, I'm taking a leap forward in time here. Apologies for that. It's your masterclass. You can do whatever you like. Well, we're supposed to be doing this together. We did prepare it together. But when I did my second fiction feature film called Camille, which is the only film that I made with a professional actress, immerse, who was an outstanding actress, I was horrible to her because it was unbearable for me, for this actress, Nina Maris, that she was her and she was not Camille. She was not the character she was supposed to be playing. It was really hard for me to accept that she was having to be an actress who had to work to become the character and that she wasn't spontaneously the character. We may come back to this later on. Well, let's not wait. Let's go back to it now. Yeah, but I said there were two things. So the first thing that I regretted was that you hadn't got to the whole world created instantly. The second thing I regretted when I left documentaries, which made me very horrible when I was preparing a film, when I was working on a documentary, we were always two of us. There was me, I had the camera, and I worked with someone who was a sound engineer, a Vietnamese guy who was also a sound engineer, and he was an assistant. He organized absolutely everything. And he was an interpreter. I speak a little bit of Vietnamese, but I didn't understand everything, so he would translate for me. And then we made this film, the pair of us, together, and it was wonderful. So when I work in fiction, I get the feeling that there's too big a team, it's too cumbersome, there are too many of us, everything's too organized, and there is a work plan. Why do we have to have a schedule? Why do we have to work on the inside when it's sunny outside? And when we want to go out into the rain, when we want to go outside, it's kind of grey skies and it's ugly. I don't understand all that. I don't like all of that. So since I've been doing fiction, I want to fight. I want to find something of these two things, these two very valuable things that we have in a documentary. Firstly, there's a world which exists, which is alive, which is rich, and you have so much to see. And secondly, you are free. If you want to film, you do so. If you don't want to film, you don't. You film when it's sunny, you don't film when it's rainy. And I go with the flow of the moment in a documentary. So yes, so you went from documentary into fiction. So you also left Vietnam at that time, and you went to the African continent there, to Democratic Republic of Congo, first of all. So how did that happen, that choice to go to a different continent? Well, I made 2 films, or 2.5 in Vietnam. They were documentaries. And I felt I was kind of chasing my tail the whole time. I thought that when I was in Vietnam, everything was better before, when I'd been to Vietnam before. I felt that I'd exhausted all my adventures in Vietnam. So I said to myself, Boris, you're becoming a grumpy old man here. Let's change the backdrop. And one of my friends went to live in the Congo. So I thought, right, I'm going to follow that friend. And I created 2 documentaries that I was going to make there. I never did make them, but they allowed me to make fabulous journeys in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So I went on location spotting trips for films which I never actually made. It wasn't the first time I was in Africa. I had been to Senegal, but it was the first time I had been steeped in the culture. Sometimes I could be on my own in these regions that were really cut off from the rest of Congo. They were amazing journeys, absolutely amazing. But I did not make the films. Okay, so there weren't the documentaries. However, it was a transition for you towards fiction. That's when you made that change. Earlier on, you said that you regret that in fiction you have to create the backdrop, and you're a bit of a punk in that way. You wished everything was like a documentary, but how did you decide to go into fiction? Well, the problem with a documentary is there's no money for documentaries anymore. So if you want to be poor, make documentaries. It's the truth. I had a feature film documentary. I spent 3 years working on it, and I earned 2,500 euros. So it's not a good business model. Yeah, you got your maths all wrong there. So that was one point. Secondly, I did not want to modify the type of documentaries I was making to suit the market or to suit TV channel demands. Whilst I was making a documentary, I felt that what I was wanting to do really was to tell a story and to develop the characters. And so quite naturally, I was drawn to fiction. And that's how it happened. I wrote a first fiction which became Hope. I submitted it to the CNC. I went to Congo for the location spotting to make my documentary. I went into the forest for several weeks, and there's no networks or anything. When I came out of the forest several weeks later, I had an email saying that the CNC was giving me some money to write a screenplay. So I said, okay, bye-bye documentaries, off I go for fiction. So Hope was your first feature film. And it was selected for a festival. It was shown at Critics Week here in Cannes, even, as Thomas mentioned earlier on. So when you were writing Hope, what were you hoping to do? What was the story you were trying to tell? Was it inspired by the location spotting you'd been on? Because it's very close to reality. It's a fiction, but it's all about real life. Yeah, this is a very interesting question. In this film, the way I worked in the film Hope, the way I wrote the screenplay was not the right way to do it. Because I started by writing a screenplay at home in France. I lived in Paris at the time. I got a lot of documents. I read a lot. I read books, stories. Hope is the story of... Have you seen Hope? Yeah, okay, so you've probably seen Hope. It's the story of two African migrants who come to Europe. And to write this, I'd read a lot of books written by journalists, a lot of stories recounted by migrants, different articles which describe the day-to-day life of a migrant on the road. And I wrote the screenplay based on that material. It took me a long time. It was my first screenplay. It took me a long time to find the dramatic driver of the film Hope. The film is a story of migrants who want to go to Europe. So one can say that that may be a driver. One might wonder, will they get to Europe or not? But that's not the right driver, because that driver does not define the characters. All migrants who are on the road want to go to Europe. So the fact of wanting to go to Europe, and whether you get there or you don't, is not a good enough storyline. So it took me a very, very long time, 2 or 3 years of writing, to come up with the real story in the film. It's not the story of one character, the main character, who's a male character. It's going to be the story of a couple. And the question was, will they get to Europe or not? And the relationship that develops between them, will it be strong enough for them to stay together? Is the human question of that relationship between a man and a woman will be stronger, more important, the simple question of getting to Europe or not? And so that was a real hard thing about writing this particular project. I needed to understand whether or not these migrants would reach Europe. I had to realize that that wasn't the driver for my film. That wasn't enough. So as I was saying, I wrote it backwards, if you like, because I wrote at home in Paris, and it was only 3 years down the line where we got subsidy from the CNC, help for production. When I got that subsidy, I went to Morocco, and I would like to commend Jean David, who was the producer. He's on the front row there, far left, from looking at the back of the room. And so I waited to have that subsidy for production before I went off to Morocco, and then I did my location spotting. It was, so normally you do your screenplay, then you go location spotting, then you go talent spotting, you know who's going to play what in which background. But when I did that, those spotting missions, I realized that I'd made a documentary. It's a bit stupid. So I reminded myself that I did have another relationship with films before this project I was working on. So I said, no, I'm not going on location spotting simply to find a backdrop for the film. I am going location spotting to find communities of migrants who are in Morocco, and through them, I will be able to pick the actors. And whilst I'm doing that, I learn a lot. So I then started my talent spotting and my location spotting. It took a long time in Morocco. And whilst I was doing that, I realized that when I was writing the screenplay, I hadn't understood what I was doing. I got it all wrong. If you've seen the film, you'll see that there are 2 key things in this world of migrants who come from the sub-Saharan region, they go to North Africa. There are 2 key elements. Firstly, migrants get organized into ghettos. The ghetto is a national ghetto. You've got one for the Congolese, one for the Malians, you've got another one for the Nigerians, and the different communities never interact, never mix. They sometimes fight one another. I saw that out in the field quite concretely. So that is something which I'd never read anywhere. None of the articles I'd read, none of the books I'd ever read, no one had mentioned that. You talk about migrants, African migrants, as if they're one huge group, but no, it's more complex than that. And so I realized that each of these ghettos had their own organization. It was with highly coded rules, which had been inspired by the Nigerians. And that's why the words are all in English. So the ghetto is headed by a chairman. And then you've got chief of defense, who's in charge of security. Then the first room, the first building that you make in a ghetto is the prison, the jail, where you lock people away who do a fuck up, to use a technical term. And I realized that there was all this organization within the ghettos, and I thought it was fascinating. I'd never read about it anywhere at all. And then the second thing I realized was that the scenario, my screenplay, was talking about prostitution. But it's completely different when you read it in a book. And then when you go out to the field and you meet the people who have experienced this. I met in Morocco, in Rabat and Casablanca, I met quite a few women who had been on the road, and I understood that all of the women who were on the road had, one way or the other, been exposed to sexual violence. It could be harassment. It could be really hardcore prostitution. And at the end of the road, i.e. in Morocco, they all ended up in extreme psychological suffering. And it was so striking for me. I asked the men, and the men said, I said to them, is it easier for a man or for a woman? A woman. And all the men said, oh, it's easier for a woman because a woman will always get by. Whereas a man can be trapped at one stage of the journey for 6 months, for example, and they can't go forward because they've got no money. So they have to work as slaves until they get a few coppers that will enable them to get to the next stage. They say it's easier for the women just to get by, in inverted commas. But when you meet the women, you understand what it means, getting by. And getting by means prostituting yourself. And when you see the psychological suffering that marks these women at the end of the road, then obviously, well, I'd written it in the screenplay, but all of a sudden it became so important, so much more important. And that's why the film is called Ho, the name of the heroine, and Leonard, the male lead, who is the central character. That's one thing, but it's her that you look at. You have eyes for her, you have empathy for her, you accompany her, and she is the reason that the film is called Hope. So this takes us back, even in your fictional work, your documentary skills were very important. One feeds into the other. It's true. I understood that I'd done things back to front. I'd written the screenplay first, and then I went out into the field. And when you make the kind of film that I want to make, when you make film which is really steeped in reality, you should do it the other way around. You should go out on your location spotting, your talent spotting, go out into the field, get involved in a community if you're talking about a community, and start there. So let's talk about Suleiman's story in a minute. But I think for Hope, that's where you met Bruno Nahan, who's your producer, who went on to produce Hope and Camille and Suleiman's story. It's interesting, I think, to talk about this relationship between the filmmaker and a producer. How do you develop the trust? And it's a relationship which is going to have to last over time. Well, when I put Hope forward to Bruno, he'd never produced a fictional film before. He had worked in documentaries, but he was switching towards fiction as well. I think it's important for the relationship between the producer and the director. It often works that way around. No. Forget what I've just said. No, there are many ways that a relationship can work. But for us, we were at the same point in our careers. We were both starting in fiction together. And so we made Hope together with very little money, a tiny amount of money. The budget was about half of what is considered a small French film. So it was absolutely tiny. So it was really hard to respect the budget
And it was a very interesting production exercise. That is, you ask yourself, how can you do such a movie? And then we kept working together. And concerning Suleiman's story, the fact that we've worked on 2 films previously meant that there was mutual trust, which made a lot of things possible. It helped us a lot because we knew one another and we knew about the other's faults. And it was very interesting to know about that because it made me very tolerant, and the trust allowed us to build things differently. So we thought about the movie in very different terms because we had a strong trust for subject and also going on location. Yes, Suleiman is my third movie, but it's the first one where I felt like I did as I pleased. It's not that I was constrained previously, but I felt that for the first time, I mastered my own style, cinematic style, and the way I wished to proceed so as to obtain the result I was looking for. So if you don't like the movie, I'm the only one to blame because I really did what I wished to do. So for starters, when I had the idea for the movie, that is during the lockup, during COVID. And what happened is that after Hope, which tells the story of those 2 African migrants going to Europe, people said, why don't you do a follow-up? Why don't you tell about what happens to the migrants once they're in Europe? And it did not feel natural because what excited me about movies was to live a new adventure far away. So shooting a movie below my place was not very exciting. And I felt that discovery was part of the excitement. But with time, I had this idea in my mind of shooting nearer to my place. And when the lockup started, I was location spotting with underage migrants that arrive in France and have no parents. And then there was the lockup during COVID, and the Parisian streets became completely empty. And the only people you could see were delivery men. And most of them came from Western Africa. And I very quickly understood that most of them were not legal migrants. They had no papers. And I became very interested in that fact. So, because I had this idea in mind and talked about it with my producer, who was very excited about it, and he understands my movies so well that he said, we'll start spotting location and you'll go with someone because it's much nicer to work with someone else. And I worked with Aline Dalbis, who spotted location with me for several months. And then 3 years later, she'll become the casting director for the movie. So we go into the Parisian streets and try to convince those deliverymen to talk to us. And Aline was much more gifted than I was, because when I came in, most of the deliverymen run away. Maybe they thought I was a policeman, I don't know, but I don't feel I look like one. Maybe you think I'm a journalist, and that's even worse for them because it's a waste of time to them. But Aline was much good at convincing them. And once they sit in a cafe with us, we can talk for hours and we can talk of everything. And it told me many, many things. So I conducted a lot of interviews with those young African deliverymen. And I gathered a lot of material with a lot of concrete elements, small stories, anecdotes, things from their daily lives, where they eat, where they sleep. And those were very important to me. And from this material, I started writing the scenario. And that's when the actual writing work starts. And that's the difficult part, because then you say, okay, what I'm going to tell? What kind of story? Because I had the subject, but it was difficult to find the story so as to develop the scenario. So the question was, what am I interested in? And it took me a long time, because first I thought, well, we can we can do something similar to the cycle stealer. But I knew about someone whose cycle was sold, and in fact, they simply bought another cycle to the black market. So everything connected to material goods, that is having your phone broken or your cycle stolen, were not very dramatic. So in 2025, or 2022 at the time, everything related to material goods were not sufficient enough to build drama. But the question of being legitimate and having papers was key. A lot of people told me, when I have an interview for asylum, that's the most important day of my life. And when they tell you that, and you're a scriptwriter, you think, well, this is something I might build upon. So very clearly, I realized that the movie would take place in a very limited amount of time, and it would concern asylum. So it was an African delivery man working on a bike and preparing for asylum. So I worked for a year and a half. And then after a while, I felt I was blocked. That because I had the script, but it didn't work that much. So I asked Delphine Lagut to come and write with me. So earlier on, you spoke of casting and how Aline helped you with the cast. So let's talk about that. But before, we'll have a look at a short extract during the...
Faut pas vous inquiéter, d'accord? Là, ce qui est important, c'est ce que vous me dites là maintenant. C'est ça qui est important. Hein? Ce qui a été déposé dans le dossier, il n'est pas trop tard pour changer. Moi, je suis là pour vous écouter. Donc, qu'est-ce qui vous est arrivé à vous? C'est quoi votre histoire à vous?
Mais c'est mon histoire, madame.
Monsieur Sangaré, il n'est pas trop tard. Hein? Moi, je suis là pour vous écouter. Pourquoi vous avez quitté la Guinée?
Enfin, c'est... En fait, c'est quand j'étais petit, quand j'avais 7 ans, c'est... Enfin, on vivait, on était chez mon père, moi et ma maman. Mais mon père a renvoyé ma maman parce qu'elle était malade, parce qu'elle... Il a renvoyé ma maman parce qu'elle parce qu'elle n'était pas comme les autres. Et
So you see Abu Sangari and Nina Maurice. And what's interesting in the movie is that you said you wish to have actors that were not professional actors, and you have this meeting between Abu Sangari, who's not a professional actor, and Nina, who has much more experience. So how did you think about the cast? Yeah, we chose that extract because I'd like to talk about the way I shot that last scene. But let's have a flashback and talk about the casting. It was obvious for me that for the movie, I would need mostly non-professional actors. The first reason was that I'm trying to find some sort of ultra-realism in my movies, and sometimes I can't obtain it with professional actors. The second reason is that I'm a white director, and because I'm white and I'm trying to tell the story of a Black person, I have to handle it with care. I cannot decide I will take actors and say, do it or do that, do this or that, because I need to work with people who know, who intimately know the reality that my movie wishes to describe, and they know it better than I do. So they will teach me something. So because I'm working with a non-professional cast, it's the question of realism, but it's also the question of how, as a director, can you tell the story of people that are very far away from you? How can I, as a white person, I'm not an African, I'm not a deliveryman, I have not walked through Africa on foot, so how can I tell their story? If I do it in a classical way with a classical cast, it's not going to work. Working with those non-professional actors, people who went through those things, who have an intimate knowledge of what it is to be in such a position, will bring me what I lack in terms of knowledge. So that was the basic decision. So we had a casting throughout Parisian streets. And I worked with Aline after 2.5 years of writing a scenario, and we went back to Parisian streets, and we knew that the character would come from Guinea. Because at the time, in Paris, most of the delivermen came from West Africa, and those coming from Guinea were the ones asking for asylum the most. So I had a lot of witness of conversation with people from Guinea that were asking for asylum. So we have a script. We know that the character comes from Guinea, that he's a deliverman. So very naturally, we start the cast with Guinean delivermen. So it's, it's similar to the ghettos when I worked on Hope. In the delivery sector, you have several places where people stop. That is the first stop they go in the morning, and it's kind of their basic place. And they are organized by communities. So there are several locations for Guineans, people from the Ivory Coast, some places for Pakistani, etc. So very quickly, I realized where the Guineans were. And I met with a lot of people. We talked with Aline. We said that we're looking for an actor, that he get a salary, that it's an actual movie with employment, because that makes things much easier when they know they're going to get paid. And we take phone numbers of people we're interested in, and we have them come in our offices and we have them play in front of the camera. So we meet with 100 people. We also go through the social network to have more applicants from Guinea. So we see 200, 300 people. But still, we can't find anyone because even if you like the real, as soon as people step into fiction, they're lost because you want your character to have something special. It must be actual, but it needs charisma. And among all those delivermen, I did not find anyone that might carry the story. So we kept on going. So we went outside Paris in several towns where we thought there were major communities. We work with associations that helped us. And that's how I met Sangaré in a city from the north of France. He was not a deliverman. He had never asked for asylum because Sangaré arrived in France when he was underage, and he asked to obtain paper because he was underage. However, the French state refused that, saying he was not underage, but he was above 18 years old. Then it went on, and when he managed to prove that he was underage when he came in Paris, it was too late because he was above 18. So it was very difficult for me to convince my producer I'm going to use an actor who has no paper, who's an illegal. And most producers would have told me, you'll have legal problems. But because there was trust between us, we thought we would do it. So we decided to hire this actor. And then we say, well, but we'll try to have a lot of actors with papers. But in fact, most of the people we hired have no papers, which put us in an illegal situation. But that's how we proceeded. Because I thought if I shot a documentary, I would shoot illegal people, and now I can offer them a salary, and I'm not allowed to do so because they have no papers. So this is how we decided to proceed. And Sangaré is extraordinary. But when we casted him, we thought he was great. We met with him, we made our decision very quickly, and we had no plan B. It was not very easy to work with him because he does not speak very easily. He had some sort of a stutter, and his relationship to language was very difficult. He also was very anxious before we started shooting because he came to Paris for rehearsals, and that mattered a lot. And he was so anxious that 2 weeks before shooting, Aline and I asked ourselves, do we need to change? Because he was constantly ill. And we were really wondering. And we were thinking, can he resist the pressure of the shooting? But as soon as the shooting started, he stopped being ill and everything went smoothly. So it's always a very important responsibility to work with someone who's never played and to put on his shoulder all the pressure of a movie, because that's something very difficult for someone to be in front of the camera. And maybe you've noticed that I have a part in the movie. It's one of the worst parts, in fact. I'm the restaurant owner that cries at Sangaré and says, go back home. Why am I playing this part? It's not because I believe I'm a great actor. I think I'm quite a bad actor, in fact. But I'm playing this part to remind myself it's very difficult to be in front of a camera. So in the morning, we were about to shoot the scene. I was so stressed. And I was thinking, why do you add yourself one more problem, which is to play a scene? This is dumb. However, it mattered to me. I did it in Hope also. I played the part of the customer in the brothels that is hit by the main character. And it was very important in our relationship. He was very happy to hit me, in fact. Because for 2 months, I've been a pain for him. And he knows that there's one day he can hit me. And he also knows that I'm aware of the difficulties that I'm facing the camera and I don't like it. So similarly in Semaine, he knows, they all see that it's difficult to play. You know, I'm here, I'm fine, I can play, I feel at ease, I can talk to you. But when you're facing the camera, you forget everything and it's very difficult. I don't know if you've played, but suddenly I feel dumb when I'm facing the camera and my head becomes completely empty. So I think it's very important as a director to remind yourself of what it feels, especially when you're working with non-professional actors. Can we talk about this scene again? How you proceeded, and then we talk about the scenes you shot in the streets, because there's a something very stark about the real. But coming back to that scene, can you tell us a few words about how you directed it? It's a huge scene. I think it lasts 17 minutes in the movie, but the first editing, it lasted 40 minutes long. So it's a scene that relies a lot on words, of abstract content you have to remember. And for Sangaré, it was a nightmare. He felt very at ease in the rest of the movie, but he was very frightened by the scene. He was frightened about scenes talking about the asylum. So when he prepares for the interview with his coach, and also the actual interview, but he was very frightened about that particular scene because it was huge, 40 minutes, and we rehearsed it several times with Nina Maurice. And through the rehearsals, the result was not good. Yes, in fact, I wanted to talk about that. We rehearsed a lot on that movie. Because I wrote a scenario, I had this cast for the streets, and then we rehearsed for a very long time, which allowed me to rewrite a lot of scenes so that all the actors could make the scenes their own. They did not have to learn pages by heart, but I explained the situation, saw how they worked on it. Sometimes they changed dialogues, but sometimes they played the situation very differently. If you take the scene with the policeman, well, the policeman playing an actual policeman. And when I'm writing policeman dialogues, I might be inspired by bad TV series. Whereas when I'm working with actual policemen, they have a specific way of talking. Also the way they behave. And they interact with their police partners. And that's very interesting. So I like that, having the way they occupy the space, they talk to one another. So they improvised a lot. And so I understood how they would play the scene. And then I kept the best parts and rewrote the scene. So it doesn't change the narrative arc of the scenario, but we rewrite the script so that when we reach the set, it's not improvisation. I still haven't asked them to learn lines by heart, but they know how the scene will proceed. So we meet again in a setting which is rather classical. It's no complete improvisation, but the interpreters have made the matter of the scenario their own. And that really matters to me. It's my methods to make sure that the non-professional comedians will play. Now, the scene. Yes, and maybe we can talk about the street, because, you know, time is flying by. So a short word about the scene. I chose the extract because there's a long moment of silence, and to me it's the climax of the movie. the scene was very lengthy. It's a very long one, and it's cut into two parts. So there's the false story and then the real one. We shot the scene on 2 days. So it was during a weekend because we decided to go in the real office of protection for refugees. So it's a place where people actually ask for asylum. So they would lend us the place for the weekend. We had Saturday and Sunday to shoot the scene, and then an extra one if it did not work. So on Saturday, we worked on the full story, and on Sunday on the actual one. And we shot completely differently. The first scene on Saturday was very classical because there was some sort of an argument. The protection officer, that is the civil servant that has the interview, she has a very strict protocol of questions. And then what mattered to me was how can she nail Sangare? So she asks a question, Sangare answers, and then she nails him, but he finds a way, and then she nails him again, he escapes, and then finally he's completely blocked by her. So this was the narrative thread of the scene. And I had written it very precisely, so it was very difficult for them to improvise or invent different arguments. So in the first part of the scene, it was quite difficult for them, especially for Sangare, because there was a lot of lines to learn, but it was a very classical device.
And that part of the scene ends in silence. That's how she traps in. And so that silence lasts, because during that silent period, he's wondering, is she offering me an opportunity or is she putting a trap on my palm? And that's the climax of the film. And I'd said to Sangare, remain silent for as long as you possibly can. Whilst you are silent, you hold on to the power. Everybody is hanging on your every word. You have the power. So he remains silent and she asks question after question. Then when he starts to speak, I said, cut. And it was frustrating because it was so intense. We were all, it was something really strong going on. But I said, cut, because I knew that we would have to start again the next day. And so the next day we did it differently. We started earlier on in the scene so that we could have a kind of takeoff runway. And then, so we did the second half of the scene and we had to do it in a different way. I'd written a text. Sangare had learned the text, but if he had recited the text which I had written, then it would have been shitty. So how can you show that a story is true compared to a false story? How can you ask an actor to be anything other than an actor? So the first step, in the second part of the story, I had written according to Sangare's real life experience. So when he talks about his mother, he is really talking about his mom. When Sangare talks about his journey, he's talking about his journey. Second thing, I said, don't recite what I've given you. So the first day, we had to work in a linear manner, in a tunnel of dialogue. But on the second day, on the contrary, we went round and round the houses, around that traumatic emotion that Sangare had. And Nina asked questions. I was asking also questions as well. And we were bringing him back to his mum. Your mum, your mum, your mum. So that he would turn around that knot of emotions. And the whole scene comes from there. And I like that when he speaks, it's so chaotic. He jumps forward in time, jumps back in time, he repeats himself, he makes mistakes, he falls over his words, and it really injects truth into that scene. You can see that this is not just acting, it's not just play acting in this scene. And that's what I love in the film. It's like as if the screen has been torn away. You're not watching a film, you really have access to something which is behind that, which is worth much more than films. There is more important things in life than film. Let's take a look at another scene. This time out in the streets, where Suleiman has to catch a bus, and it's a bit of an odyssey.
Patron.
Ouais. T'es inscrit? Oui. C'est quoi ton nom?
Samuel.
Ah, Sangaré?
Oui.
Mon ami, t'es toujours en retard.
Désolé, en fait, j'ai un accident.
La prochaine fois, attention.
Merci.
C'est bon, les gars. C'est quoi ça, là?
Hey, Suleiman.
Hey.
Allah,
Allah.
Allah ni ini.
Allah.
Lu de Paris.
Oh.
Vous dans les bois ou bien?
Ah non.
Allez s'amuser un peu.
Ah oui, mec.
So what would you like to say about shooting that scene? We've seen several places in Paris, different modes of transport. There's that kind of speed. How do you film that? First of all, I'm struck as I see that excerpt that we're in the underground, the Paris underground, the real Paris underground with real passengers. And a bus is a false bus, if you like. It's a bus which I had chartered. And in it, I've got actors and it sums up our approach to this film is to make a fictional film, but to anchor it in real life. As I said at the very beginning, Suleiman is the first film that I really made as I wanted to make a film. So I designed the film crew that I wanted. Since the first time I'd made a film, I really struggled to have as small a team as possible. Some directors want a big team. I want a small team. I want to have fewer technicians. So I'll say to myself, okay, I'll have 4 people in the team. And then you meet the director of photography, and he says, well, I need 3 people to help me. And then you see the sound engineer, and he said, I need 2 people to work with me. And it just grows like a snowball. And you've got a smaller team, but that's at least 15 to 20 people. So for Suleiman's story, I said, okay, we're going to be strict about this. And I remember the discussion that I'd had with my first assistant. I said, we're going to hold the reins tight right to the end. No lighting. No fax drops, apart from when we're in the institution at night, where we did have to have a big team. Otherwise, small team, 12 people, including all the technical teams. But for the first week of the shoot, there were only 5 of us, including myself. So it was me plus 4 technicians, and we did a whole week like that. And that particular week was all important for the rest of the project. Most of the film, obviously, the 7 other weeks, we did have a kind of normal team, i.e. 12 or so technicians. but it is small in comparison to many other projects, but it's more or less standard. But the fact that we started the film with 4 technicians, it really does lay out the dynamics of the film moving forward. And that was how we were able to film in the city. In the film, we never close any roads down. If you want to film in traffic, you can't block the roads unless you're making Mission Impossible. And you've got $100 million in your budget there. Yes, you can bring all the cars in that you like. However, I did not have $100 million in my budget. And in this case, the only way to do it is to leave the road as it is. That was so exciting to me. Right from the very outset, I wanted to be a film in Paris, a film about Paris. It's not the Paris that I know, it's the Paris that Suleiman knows. But it had to tell the story of the city, so you had to delve into the reality of the city. No streets were closed. And that meant that we had to be a small team, so that we were agile. At the beginning, everyone was saying why we couldn't do it like that way. People will say, well, all of the people in the street will be looking at the camera. So if you were filming in Africa, yes. If you're filming in Paris, well, the good thing about Paris is that people don't give a hoot. Parents don't give a hoot about anything. They just want to move forward, get where they're going, and the important thing is that you don't close the roads down. And that was wonderful. Those people who want to kind of get to where they need to go are perfect in my film. So I see actors who are paid to pretend they're not there on purpose, and it's very unnatural. I didn't want to create false disorder, but you can recognize false disorder. You see the scene where he goes into the Paris Underground? I fought with the authorities, the RATP, who run the Underground, because I was talking to them for months, because I was telling them it's a story about a guy who gets on the Underground at Barbès, which is a busy station. And they were saying, no, you have to do it in the terminus station and use your actors. So I wanted people not to be advised that the scene was going to be filmed. You see the shot that we captured when he was zigzagging and he jumps into the Underground train? My director of photography did not like that scene because somebody came out of the train, and Suleiman had to change his route to get in. The director of photography hated it. I loved it. It's the perfect scene for me. It really is important, but it took a lot of time. And this is my 3rd film. It is the first time I've been able to say that, yes, I'm going to design the team that I want to make the film that I want. And it's not the technicians who are going to tell me what kind of film I'm going to make. It's me who's going to find, with their help, how we can make my film. I don't want to boss them around and impose things upon them. We had a perfectly rich partnership, but it's taken me 3 films to get here. So I'm a slow learner, you might say. It's taken me 3 films to learn how I want to make films, how I want to organize my teams to get the film that I want. And the difficult part was, how do we shift? No, I'm going to change what I'm talking about. When he was on his bicycle, that was really hard. I thought about that with my director of photography for months. How were we going to film that bicycle ride? I wanted to be in the movement. I didn't want to be standing on the pavement and watching the bicycle go by. No, we wouldn't have the feeling of dynamism which we wanted. And I couldn't be in a car to film either, because a car stops in a traffic jam. So that wasn't going to work. We could have been on a motorbike, but motorbikes can't really go through a red light very easily. When you're on a motorbike, you're not supposed to go on the cycle track. However, the only solution for the entire team to be on a bicycle also. So we were all on bikes. There was one bike for the camera. It's one of those cargo bikes with a kind of trolley in the rear. So there's one of those cargo bicycles when we were filming from in front, and there was a kind of longer version of a bicycle when we were filming from the side or the rear. There was another bicycle for the sound. Sometimes I was pedaling that bicycle with my sound engineer behind me on the same bicycle, and then there was another assistant who was kicking the buses out of the way so that we could move forward. It was very exciting. We really captured the sensations of the city, and we worked really a lot in the film. There's no music in my film. The music of the film is the music of the city. we worked right up to the editing and the mixing to make sure that the mixing was dynamic. We often would remove a lot of sound, and it means you're almost holding your breath. But occasionally, when you go out into the city, the city crashes into your face and into your ears. It's very brutal. So I really wanted the views. You've seen the films on computers with horrible sound, I'm sure, which is a shame. But if you had seen the film in a movie theatre, then you'd realize you really do feel the city. And it was so important for me that there's no music in there at all. There's no artifice there. It's not artificial at all. And so there's no music, but there is sound. Let's talk about Congo Boy also. But before that, we'll say that it is in the Suleiman story was screened here in France. Suleiman won a prize. You've got 4 French movie awards here for Suleiman's story. So what does it change for you to see? Yes, you'd had awards for the other films, but for Suleiman's story, it had been seen, recognized, it had become a legend. So what did that mean for you? What did it change for you? Did it change something for Boris, the director? I haven't got any new films on the drawing board yet, so I haven't asked for funding yet, so I don't know. I think what changes more than the prize is that the film has drawn a lot of people into the movie theatres. There's 650,000 people went to see that film in France 18 months after its release. It is still in the movie theatres. As of September this year, the film will enter into a special program for school children. There are hundreds of thousands of school children in France who will go and see that film. It's so important for me that the film is seen by high school children here in France. This is the only way that cinema reaches all categories, all colours. It's the same for art house movies. So to have this success for a film which was made with such a small budget and was not designed to be a commercial success, I think that really does change the equation. And I know now that my future projects will be easier to produce. People are very kind in things they say about the film, and they're nice with me. So that's new. That's good too. Yes, that must be pleasant. So this year you're back in Cannes as a producer this time for Congo Boy by Fabrique Cinéma. So this particular film is a symbol of your work as a trainer, someone who passes things on. You've organized training courses in different regions of Africa. You've got a production company out there in Africa. So how does this new film epitomize your other hat, which is that of passing skills on? When I went to Central Africa Republic to make my second feature film, which is called Camille, I said, I'm going to turn up in a very poor country. I'm going to take something from that country. I'm going to make a film. Can I not give something back to that very poor country? And so I said, why not possibly organize some training courses on how to make a documentary film? So I contacted a French NGO called Atelier Véran, which knew how to organize these workshops. And so I wanted to give an opportunity to people who don't make films in countries where there are very few films, or in regions where there are few movie halls. I wanted to give them an opportunity to tell their own story. I wanted to give them a tiny bit of technical training, but I wanted to help them to know how to look at things and to see things. So that was my idea. That was 2017. We had a first workshop on documentaries in 2017, and that's where I met Rafiki, who we're going to talk about in a moment. And so we recruited 10 apprentice directors. So Central Africa Republic, back in that time, there was nothing to do with the movies. There were no no cinemas. There was no industry. There were no production companies. There were no directors. There had been a Central African film many years ago, but the director was dead now. There were no technicians, absolutely nothing there. So I show up in this place. We organize this training course. We get people to come to it who have no experience of the movies because in that country there is nothing. But they were all amazing. There they are. They turn up with lots of energy and desire. They've got stories to tell. They're so creative. And we do this workshop for 2 months. And during that time, they learn everything about the movies. And they all make a short documentary. And out of those 10 trainees, there are at least 5 or 6 films which are magnificent. Short documentaries that last about 20 minutes. They're real films. After that, the following year, we do it again. It was such a success. It was so amazing that absolutely everybody wanted to continue. There was money to do it, so we launched a second workshop on documentaries. We thought we'll take the same students and help them progress even more. In the meantime, I'd made my film Camille, which you may have seen. And I asked them all of those 10 trainees to work with me. So they all came into my film crew, and that's how they gained experience working on a fiction film, which is very, very different to what they'd experienced doing a documentary. The next year, there's a second workshop. For the third year, I said, okay, that's fine. We'll work on fiction. We're going to create a film school. I worked with a French film school called Fabrique. It's not the Fabrique, it's the Fabrique. It's the second biggest movie school here in France. And we set up something which is called Ciné Bangui because it's in the town of Bangui in Central Africa. We train people, we wonder what they're going to do afterwards. There's no industry, so we're going to have to create a production company. We joined forces with an Italian who is my training partner and a Central African person who was the best budding director. And the three of us, we launched Makongo Films, which is a production company. We produced 4 documentaries, which are shown in the biggest festivals around the world, win a lot of awards, particularly one called Nous étudiants, We Students, which is in Berlin. And finally, gradually, we are developing our own fiction films, and we work with Rafiki Arayala as of 2021, and he's starting to write. I'm helping him with his writing, quite a lot, in fact. I helped him. It was his first fiction film on a story from his own life. It's a film that became a Congo Boy, and it is in the Un certain regard section here. And that film in Un certain regard is the fruit of 10 years of work in Central Africa. I had read an article back in the day about Colombian film, and they said that there had been a big change in public policy in Colombia, and that it had taken 10 years to bring forward a generation of Colombian filmmakers who went on to be successful in all of the main festivals around the world. So I turned up in Central Africa. I was a bit pretentious, and I said, we will start in 5 years, we'll be in Cannes. It took us 10 years as well, like the Colombians. But that's the fruit of our efforts, and it's the beginning of a new period. I think I'm going to be able to hand this production company on. There's no reason for me to remain a Central African producer. I think we're going to hand that over to the Central African people.
Maman de maman, la big boss, la big boss, la big boss. Hey, ma chapeau.
So it's a film about a young musician. It's an autobiography. Rafiki had been involved in singing and music before he turned to the cinema. So that is a scene of Latalaku. That's what it's called in Africa. It's in a nightclub when a singer will sing songs for people who are in the room, and that person will give them a note. And if you had been at our party here in Cannes yesterday, the actor was there and he did that song and he earned a lot of money going around the room. Any questions? There's a question over there. Good evening. Samuel was at the party last night and he gave a lot of money away. So thank you very much for your generosity. And it's nice for me to speak in French, he says, looking at the interpreters. Yesterday, I saw your last film. I know a question and a bit of a concern, really. So, how did you manage to work with people who are in such extreme situations, such extreme poverty, politically, socially, in difficult situations, given that you're going to make a film, you just come for a certain amount of time. And those people, afterwards, they will just continue in their difficult lives. You've got your own life, your own family, possibly. I know it's your job, but a film doesn't take up your whole life, although it will stay with you for your whole life. How do you continue to live with that? How does it impact you? I saw for Semaine story, the actor there, Sangare, he's very popular on the networks. We all know his story now. We all know about his ID documents, etc. But I'm just want to know about you. How do you feel about this? How do you cope with that, psychologically and humanely speaking? It's not easy. For the film Hope, it was rather unsatisfactory for me afterwards. Let me tell you why. When we prepared Hope, the first thing we did when we went out, we found unknown actors. We found the two key characters and we extracted them from their environment, and they came to live with us, with me, and with the team for several months while we were rehearsing. Endurance, who plays Hope, she had a baby. We recruited a nanny to look after the baby, and we took them out of their environment. I was fully aware that obviously I was taking them out of a very difficult situation, and their dream machine started to work. Every day I said to them, practically every day, I said, we're making this film together, but that does not mean that you are going to have a Hollywood career. Enjoy the moment. Take the money. Do something with this money. But don't start to imagine that it's going to be the start of a career. And in fact, there was no career for either of them. They went back to a very difficult life afterwards. It wasn't exactly the life which we see in the film. They are slightly better off than the characters in the film because they were no longer on the road. But they went back to their African lives, and it was not easy for them. I tried to help them a little bit. I had very little money myself. We made that film with a tiny, tiny amount of money. So economically, I too was in a difficult situation. I did some fundraising to organize a project to help both of those lead actors. But even that only lasts for a certain while. Several years later, it was all over and done with, and they'd gone back to their difficult African lives. It's hard for me. But then I went to Central Africa. And in Central Africa, every day people would come to me asking me to help them. I can help some, sometimes I can't. In Africa, I've learned how to say no to people. I can't help everybody. But it's very unpleasant for me. When I made Solomon's story, I said, okay, we'll try and do things better this time. As I said earlier on, Sangare had no papers when he was making our film. He had asked for his papers before we started the shoot. And whilst I was in the editing, he had heard that he was not going to be given papers by the French government. I was flabbergasted. I thought he'd get those papers, but no, he was being refused papers. So I said, okay, we'll try and use the film to get him his papers. But with Cannes and the Best Actor Prize, I thought he would have his papers within the week. But no, it was really difficult. We had to go up to see politicians at the top of the ladder, even the Élysée Palace. The Ministry for Culture, we went to see them, but we could not get papers for him. It took months until I found the right inroad. But it was absolutely obvious to me that my work on Suleiman's story would end when he had papers. He's got his papers now. He's got them thanks to the film, so that was really important. Now, Sangaree is someone who I see very often still. We meet up. And I think I may even make another film with him. His situation today is difficult. It's better than it was. But Sangaree, when you talk to him, he will always say how grateful he is to the movies. The film industry has changed his life. He's got proper papers. He had a salary for the first time. For the first time in his life, he's got an apartment. So he's really grateful. But now, that doesn't mean his life is easy. So I think that he's going to be making 2 films this summer. He's not done anything since Suleiman's story, but he'll be doing 2 this summer. And I monitor him. I'm following him. I'm introducing him to an agent. So I've chosen the right agent for him, with him. So it is a concern. When you work with non-professional actors, it is a concern. It is worrying. You're taking people who've had a difficult life, you pluck them out of it, and you put them into a dream situation, but then they've got to go back to reality. You can do it perhaps better. You can do it not too bad. You can soften the blow, but reality remains. Despite everything, they go back to their lives. Apart from a few exceptions, some people who can be plucked off the street and have a career. It can happen, but it's very rare. But most of the time, they go back to their lives that they knew before. You can help them a little bit. I'm still in touch with quite a few people. You can help, but you don't have the power to change their lives always. And that's something you just have to bear. The question over there?
Thank you.
Boris, bonjour. Je suis tombée sur l'histoire de Suleiman l'année dernière sur un vol. Je n'avais aucune information sur le film, mais je l'ai regardé et je l'ai vraiment apprécié. Et lorsque j'ai vu que vous étiez ici cette année, j'ai pensé que c'était une coïncidence divine. J'ai aussi vu Hope. Et le personnage principal est nigérien et moi je viens de ce pays. Donc je suis très consciente des situations et des migrants qui partent du Niger pour essayer d'avoir en Europe. J'ai beaucoup apprécié ce casting avec des gens qui venaient du Niger et leurs interactions, la façon dont ils s'expriment et de quelle façon nous sommes actifs. J'ai été extrêmement surpris de la façon dont vous avez réussi à capter cela. C'était un film difficile à regarder parce que les femmes sont exposées à de nombreux dangers durant ce voyage. Lorsqu'on regarde Hope, elle doit avoir une petite vingtaine ou même être une adolescente. La question que j'ai à vous poser, c'est comment vous avez réussi à capter ce voyage depuis l'Afrique de l'Ouest, en Afrique du Nord et en Europe. Je suis curieux de savoir quelle intention vous aviez lorsque vous avez tourné ce film. J'ai parlé avec des réalisateurs nigériens qui disent que parfois nous ne voulons pas filmer la violence dans les films. Ou alors nous suggérons les abus sexuels mais nous ne les montrons pas. Donc, quelle était votre intention lorsque vous avez montré tout cela à la caméra? Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. I must say that I felt a lot of pleasure when I shot with all those people from Nigeria, those stealers, you know, because when we had the cast, we looked for the worst people, the most fearful one, those who shouted, and the people I felt had been violent previously, because I did not feel like seeing an actor pretending with violence. I wanted to have people who are aware of violence. And I was actually fascinated by those Nigerians, their charisma, the way they talked. I loved the way they talk because it's a very specific way. And the vocabulary, there is a specific language on the road which only belongs to the road. They even made up Nigerians who went on the road. They made up what they call a constitution. So it's really organized. Sorry, but I'm going astray. Now, to answer you, the first intention when I made the movie, but then it changed throughout as I was filming. But the first intention is that I was fascinated by those trips through Africa. I thought, well, in our contemporary world, in a very actual world of simple people, there are trips that remind me of the Odyssey. That is something from far away back in time. So there's something really fantastic about such trips, because if I'm taking a bus or a plane to travel the world, then it's quite easy. But for those people who have no papers, the way they organize their journey has surreal proportions. It's not so natural, but it's over the top. It's surreal. So what I was really interested in is that if I looked at migrant trips, I could unite two things which I wish to have in my cinema. First, to have a cinema that films the real, and second, to have an epic kind of cinema. So an epic which does not talk about crusades or knights and dragons, you know, stories from the past. So being able to do an epic right now, and a real epic, was something really fascinating. So I was mesmerized by those stories, and I only listened to those people who took those trips. And to me, it's like European travelers in the 16th century. So the sentence that summed up the project was, today, adventure is on the side of people from the south going to the north. I thought the work of the non-professional actor was really interesting. And my question was, do you write a character and then you try to find the people fitting the character, or do you find the right person? Well, the key is money, you know. So if you need money, you need to write a script. So you have to write an actual script with characters who are defined. Otherwise, people will tell you they do not feel real and you won't get the money. So I write actual scripts. And then it's in between what you're saying. I wrote for a specific character and I'm looking for him, but then sometimes I find someone and I'm trying to adapt the script to him. But when you work with non-professional characters, you have to listen to them. And I feel that I'm listening much more than I'm directing. Thank you. To talk about the script, I think it's very essential and we're all working at those stage right now. So I would be interested in hearing you talk about script writing, and I'd like to know how you worked with Delphine, which roles you take on.
Alors, j'ai eu des co-scénaristes.
Well, I had a co-scriptwriter with the Semaine story and also Camille. In each case, they joined me when I had started writing. So it was my project, and the relationship is quite different than when you start writing with someone right from scratch. So when it came to a Suleiman story, I had already different versions of the scenario. And I like starting on a project by myself first, at least to write a first version. And then I like working with people. I loved working with Delphine because I think it's very rich. You have some sort of a to and fro movement, and I think it's very rich because you work 10 times better because you need to solve several problems in the script. Now you have to find the right balance between developing your own universe and collaborate with someone that allows you to move forward. So I like working with co-writers, and right now I'm working on a series, so I have several co-writers. But I'd like to have at least a first version, even if it's not a good one. Yeah. Hi. Bonjour. Je viens du Kenya. J'ai beaucoup aimé ce dont vous avez parlé en ce qui concerne votre procédé créatif. Parce que au final, nous avons, c'est très difficile d'avoir du budget. Et je trouve que la façon dont vous avez tourné dans la rue est vraiment très belle. J'avais deux questions. Both et Semaine sont des migrants. Qu'est-ce qui vous a attiré vers ce sujet? Et pour le public africain et les réalisateurs, il y a la question du regard. Et vous faites des histoires qui sont difficiles. Mais comment est-ce que vous pouvez éviter la question éthique?
Rather than just being me, say, but they're
and a collaborator.
As I said previously, this question of feeling legitimate is a question I'm asking myself. And I am aware it's not very simple.
You can hear the translation?
J'ai question, c'est pas, il y a rien d'évident.
You know, there's nothing obvious for a white director to talk about Black people in very difficult social situations. Sometimes people ask me, especially the youth, they say, what's your legitimacy to do such movies? And my answer is, my legitimacy is none, but I'm not sure the movie is impossible. However, when you're not legitimate, you have to work a lot. So I tend to have a lot of documents so that I don't wish to tell a story which is not true. Then have non-professional actors because they bring me their background, their experience, and they can teach me things. And then on set, working with them in a specific way because I'm very attentive to who they are. And very often, I suggest they work on a scene and I realize they don't feel at ease. When I worked on Hope, with the people from Cameroon and Nigeria, there was a lot of debate and I really liked it. And they said, well, we cannot do the scene in this way. And in my team, I had a lot of Moroccan technicians because that's where we shot. And the Moroccan technician had difficulties understanding that. So there was a Moroccan decorator, and he thought that he knew how you built a ghetto. Then I talked to 3 extras, and I said, well, talk to him because they know how to build a ghetto and they will tell you how to do it. So you have some time to accept, to listen, reverse roles. And I'm really trying to listen as much as I can on set. And sometimes people say the scene is lame, so I try to do it again. Is there one last question? Oui, je suis très en retard. Je voulais vous demander rapidement. Je suis réalisateur d'Afrique du Sud et j'ai une façon de travailler assez semblable à ce que vous faites. Et c'est un défi parce qu'on fait de la recherche et on veut voir mettre tout ce qu'on a vu dans le film. Pour moi, le film fonctionne parce que, en fait, il a eu les papiers grâce à sa mère. Et je pense que c'est pour ça que le film fonctionne. Et il y a aussi un danger lorsque vous mettez de l'émotion dans un film parce que cela peut devenir un mélodrame. Et du coup, cela veut dire que on part un peu du réalisme, du réalisme social. Est-ce que vous utilisez quelque chose qui est tout à fait réel? Afin de donner au public un point de vue, mais aussi des sensations. Est-ce que vous comprenez ce que je veux dire? I think that's one of the reasons why in Semaine story I felt that's the reason why in Semaine story I felt that I wanted my movie to be raw, stark. This is why I didn't use any music to underline drama or feelings. No lighting that was too sophisticated. So I tell the director of photography on that movie. So director of photography, I said, your electro head. Well, you won't have light. You need to find setting when there's lighting. And there also, for the setting, there was also a location spotter. So it's a way of working where you don't want to add layers, and you are looking for the truth. With Suleiman is traveling through a Paris which is not my city. I tried to find a Paris which was the city as Suleiman would feel it. And it requires some sort of anthropological outlook. You enter a group, a community, and you try to understand how they work. This is what I did with Hope also, when I tried to understand how the ghettos were organized and what were the power relationships. So you have to be very careful to the way people talk to one another, the way Nigerians talk to one another in the ghetto for Hope, or the way deliverment speak to one another. So you observe a lot, and then when you shoot, you're trying not to lose what you learned previously. Sometimes you find people and you cast them, and when they come to the shooting, it's all been destroyed because they have this idea of what is it to play, and you've lost their raw reality. Same thing when you've learned a lot of things, when you listen, and then when you make up your film, the making takes over. So the difficulty is when you try to manufacture the movie, you have to be very cautious about truth. That is what you had in mind when you listened to them. I think we can thank Boris a lot for the masterclass and thank you for your question. And have a nice